So let's move on now. Let's talk about socialism and capitalism. Let's delve into chapter 2 of the book and look at some basic ideas with these two concepts. Today we talk about socialism and capitalism a lot. And depending on what kind of a circle you run in, being called one or the other is either an extreme compliment or a great insult. But what are the differences, and why should we prefer one over the other? Let's look into that now. First of all, let me ask you, have you ever heard of either of these? As we begin to talk about socialism and capitalism, let's look at this, some history here. Those of you who are old as I am, you might remember the USSR, the Soviet Union. Well, did you know what the USSR stands for? It stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So the Soviet Union was a socialist nation, not only a communist nation, but a socialist nation. Now here's one that's really going to shock you. Do you know what Nazi means? Do you know what the abbreviation Nazi means? It stands for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler's Germany was socialist. And a Nazi is a socialist, a national socialist. That's what a Nazi is. We don't even know our history, folks, and we're starting to talk about going towards systems that have been incredibly oppressive. Well, let's go. Let's look at this. I'm going to go to a different view here so you can see the whole screen. Well, let's look at the difference between these two systems. There really are only two economic systems. There's socialist and there's capitalist. And these exist, if you're looking at the screen here, I've got each one of these on one side, socialist on the left and capitalist on the right. And then at the top I've got a line with arrows on each side that's showing that it's a continuum. That there really are no purely capitalist nations, and there are very close to purely socialist, but there aren't many purely socialist nations. Nations exist on this line somewhere, on a continuum. So the United States would be towards the right here, a more capitalist, which is also called a free market economy, and we'll talk about why in a moment. And over on the far left, you'd have someone like North Korea that is a socialist or a command type of economy. And then you have nations that exist along this spectrum in different places. So you really only have two types of economies. And what economies try to do is answer some questions. The economic system that we have is answering some questions about how we're going to fulfill our unlimited wants with limited resources. And there are questions like, what are we going to make? We've got limited farmland, limited factories, limited workers. What are we going to make with those limited resources? How much are we going to make? And how are we going to determine that? What price are we going to sell the stuff that we make at? How do we determine the price? Who owns the resources? Who owns the factories? Who owns the land? Who controls the labor? Who gets the resources? Who owns and gets the money from the resources? Who gets the money from the prices when things are sold? Who makes the profit? Who gets to keep it? These two systems, socialist on the left and capitalist on the right, they answer these questions differently. A socialist answers these questions like this. What are we going to make? What price are we going to sell things at? Who owns it? Is all determined by a central authority. A central authority. Someone in the government. Some kind of a government planner or government department. So as you move from capitalist on the right to socialist on the left, you move more towards a central authority. The government starts to make more decisions about the economy, labor, production, prices, all of that kind of thing. And there's a philosophy that underpins socialism. The word social means people. It means people. So a socialist economy, the underlying philosophy is that all the resources in the economy, all the money, all the land, all the labor, all the production, all the factories, ought to benefit everyone equally. That's the philosophy behind socialism. That everyone should get the equal amount of everything. That there shouldn't be anyone making more than anyone else. But what happens in a socialist system is the only people that have to wrestle with getting all the same are the regular common citizens. The central authority always benefits and always lives high on the hog. Even in North Korea, the dictator of North Korea is probably the only overweight North Korean that there is, because everybody else is starving, but he's living high on the hog. So that's what happens. And so another part of this underlying philosophy in socialism is that there are some people in the nation who know better than others. Some people just know what you need more than you do. They know what things should be priced at more than the business owner does. They know what you should pay for products more than you know. So there's this underlying philosophy that in a socialist system, there is a government that's kind of in charge, more in charge, and it's because they believe they know better than the common everyday people. But on the other side of this, who makes the decisions about these questions of what to make and what price to charge and who gets the profit and all of that? In a capitalist system believes that individuals should make these decisions. The man who owns the plant should decide how much to make and what to make. And the buyer on the street should decide how much they're going to pay. And the individual should own the resources and therefore get the profit that comes from those resources. So the underlying philosophy in capitalism is that the benefit of the resources should be based on the productivity, the work ethic, and the risk of the individual. So if I am willing to risk my entire fortune starting a business and work 90 hours a week for 10 years to get it going, then I should reap the benefit of that, and you should not. You should reap the benefit of what you are willing to produce and you are willing to do. Now that doesn't mean that in a capitalist society that the poor get nothing. I'll show you later on in our series that the poor in the United States are cared for better than anywhere else in the world. It's stunning how much the poor get in the United States, and it's actually caused us some problems. So the underlying philosophy, to take it a step further, is that each individual knows what is best for himself. That the government doesn't know better. There aren't in the capitalist system, the individual rules, the individual makes the decision, the individual is considered the arbiter of what's best. Not the government, not some third party. And as you see in our nation, as you see the talk of our government and the talk of some of our politicians, you can tell that they begin to think that they know better. They know better than us, and so they're starting to take more power and make more decisions. And so that is the move from capitalism on the right to socialism on the left. But the United States is not a 100% capitalist country. We have socialist systems and institutions right now, like K through 12 education, for example. It's completely socialist. The government decides everything there is about public education and runs it and manages it and owns the resources and everything else. So we're not 100% capitalist, but we are on the right side, not necessarily meaning correct, but on the right side of this spectrum. So we want to look at three factors now and ask ourselves, what is the best system? What is the best way to take these limited resources and spread them over all of these wants that we have? Is a socialist way of doing it better, where there's someone in the government who makes the decision and there's a group of people who know better? Or is it better to let the individual do that? Which system provides the best for people's needs? And we're going to look at three different factors. Information, I'll explain what that is, incentive, and freedom. So let's now look at capitalism and socialism from the standpoint of information. What do I mean by information here? Well, what I mean is, if you think about the questions that economic system is trying to answer, what do we make, how much do we make, how much do we charge for it, those kinds of questions. In order to make that decision for an entire country, you have to have a lot of information. Let's say that you are thinking about the shoes that you want produced next year. All right? In a socialist system, there'd be someone in the government who's trying to figure out what kinds of shoes, what kinds of patterns, what kinds of styles, price levels, all of that stuff. In a capitalist society, the individuals will be doing that. The individual business owners, the manufacturers of shoes, the individual consumers will be making choices about which ones they bought. So the question is, who has the best information so that we can most efficiently get these resources out to people? Well, let's say there's a guy in the government. Let's look at the socialist system. We're going to call him Mr. Giddy Government. Giddy Government, G-U-B-M-E-N-T. Yes, that is a little pun on government. Mr. Giddy Government. And he is the greatest guy you could ever meet. He is the nicest guy. He loves his fellow citizens, and he loves shoes. And so he is going to try and make the decisions for what is going to be produced in the economy next year for shoes. So how well would he be able to do that? Think about that for a moment. Let's say that he decided that he saw a lot of green and red shoes being worn this year. So he said, we're going to key up the factories and we're going to make green and red shoes next year. And he went and he visited every factory in the country, and he spent every waking hour trying to figure out exactly what everybody was going to want for shoes. And then the next year came along and people didn't want green and red shoes or blue and red shoes or whatever. They wanted something different. You see, the fact of the matter is, Giddy Government, no matter how much he tried, no matter how many hours he spent, he would not be able to figure out the preferences of 300 million people for shoes, like the tens of thousands of businesses and the tens of millions of individuals making individual decisions, doing individual research, making adjustments on the fly, day in, day out, would be able to do. You see, no matter what he tried to do, he could not do a good enough job regarding taking these resources and getting them out there to the people, the shoes, because he would not have enough information to do that. And this is one of the great weaknesses of socialism. Kevin Williamson, in his book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Socialism, talked about this problem in the Soviet Union. Remember, I told you the Soviet Union is a former nation that was socialist and broke up in, I think, 1991. But he wrote this. He said, the odd thing is that shortages appeared in product lines of which the Soviet Union was the largest producer in the world. In the late 1980s, the USSR, remember the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, produced more than 3 pairs of shoes for each citizen. That's a lot of shoes. But people had to wait to buy shoes. The problem was that the available shoes did not reflect consumers' tastes. The shoes were made to fulfill a government plan, not to satisfy market demand. So in this case of information, it's pretty easy to see that there's no way that a socialist system could be better than a capitalist system, because the capitalist system is going to have more individuals, more people spread out across the whole country making individual free decisions about products and services all year long. And there's no way a government entity could do that. So when you're looking at which is best from an information standpoint, capitalism or a free market economy is best. Now let's look at incentive. This is a critical point. Incentive. What do I mean by incentives? If you think about a socialist versus a capitalist system, and if you think about in a socialist system where the goal is that everybody has the same of everything, and so no matter what you do, as you move more towards socialism, you lose the incentive, you lose the reward for your individual effort and productivity, because the government is beginning to take more and more of what you produce to give it to other people. Remember, socialism is the idea that everybody should have equal of the nation's resources. There should be no rich and there supposedly should be no poor. But because of these things that we're going to talk about, socialism always leads to more poverty. But if let's say that I wanted to start a business, and I love, let's say I loved music, and I wanted to produce my own music, and I wanted to help other artists get their start in music, and as I went along, I would make a little bit of profit on all that I had done, and so I would receive the benefit of that. So that would be a great motivation for me. But if the government came along and said, Wes, I don't care how much you like music, I don't know how good you are at music, I don't care how many people you help. When you're done, we're going to take your profit away from you, and you're only going to have as much as you had before you started that business. what is the likelihood that I would start that business? There is no reason for me to start that business because I have no incentive to start that business. Now think about the United States. Think about all the amazing things that have been invented here, created here, all the valuable things that have produced so much prosperity and income. Think about the iPhone. The iPhone was made in the United States of America. The MRI was made in invented in the United States of America. Video games were invented in the United States of America. So the question is, why were these not invented in Russia? Why were these not invented in Cuba? Why were these not invented in Venezuela? Because in those places there is no incentive to invest your creativity, take risk, and produce these kinds of items. In the United States, the creators of these inventions had the incentive to create them because they were free to create and they were free to reap the benefits of those creations. Steve Jobs was a very wealthy man. We're going to talk about the rich in another session. But he was not a very wealthy man because he stole from people. He was a wealthy man because he created things that were very valuable and people willingly gave him their money because of the value that he gave to them. But Steve Jobs only did that because he had the incentive. If you take away incentive, this is absolutely critical. You take away the individual effort of human beings, and that can only lead to poverty. How do we do that today? How do we take away incentives? We're not a socialist nation yet. There's a lot of talk about socialism in the United States, and there are a lot of efforts in our government to move us and in the pop culture to move us towards socialism. But we're not there yet. But how do we take away incentive? We take away incentive by taxing the rich, high taxes on the rich. There were politicians that came out with plans to take anything over $1 million in income as 100% tax. Well, why in the world risk your fortune to create something that's valuable and benefit humanity if the government's going to take all your taxes? So you don't have to go and become the Soviet Union or the Nazi Germany to kill incentive. And as you kill incentive, you kill invention, creativity, and prosperity. This is a critical weakness of socialism. We control prices. We'll talk about prices when we talk about living wages and things like that. When you say to a business, hey Wes, you go ahead and you start selling your records and your albums and your songs, but you can only sell them for 25 cents a piece. You can't sell them for any more than that. I don't care how much it costs you. Well, where's the incentive to create the song then? Where's the incentive to create the new medical device? And overregulation of industries. We overregulate them. We just bog them down with so many rules that it becomes fruitless and pointless to keep trying to create things and create value and create wealth because it's just too much trouble. And Donald Trump, during the early part of his presidency, one of the things that many attributed to the success of the economy during most of his term was the reduction of regulations, just taking this government control. See, the government doesn't have to own something to control it to such a point that it becomes a de-incentive to even have that business. So let's go back then and let's look at our scorecard here. How are we doing on the scorecard so far? We've got information that goes to the capitalist, the free market. We've got incentive that goes to the free market because each individual can benefit. There is the maximum amount of incentive in a capitalist economy for folks to produce. So let's look at freedom now. This will be the last one that we look at. Let's look at freedom. What about freedom? What is the freedom connection? All right. Think about it. As we move on that spectrum from capitalist and free markets to government control, to where the government has to make the decisions, we necessarily have to give more of our freedom over to the government because the economy touches every part of life. We have to give up our freedom for negotiating our own labor rates because the government's going to tell us how much we're going to get paid. We have to give up our freedom to make decisions about what we want to buy. The government's going to say, you don't get to choose. You get this or you get that. Those are the only options that you have. As you move towards government control, the government has to control things like the trucks and the factories and the labor schedule and the hours and management techniques, and they get to control everything. Government control of the economy requires government control of the people. It's just a natural outflow of the system. The government has to start to control more things as you move to more socialism because it has to do that to take control of the economy. Ronald Reagan saw this, and if you have time to go back and look at any of his old speeches, even before he became president, he saw that as the government becomes more socialist, as the economy becomes more socialist, the government becomes more controlling because of the nature of socialism. He said a government can't control the economy without controlling people. And America's founding fathers knew when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. So as we come along and we cry out for the government to don't let those rich drug companies make so much money, or why can't I get paid more? Government, make sure I get a higher wage, or government, give me more free stuff. Give me what's fair. Give me what's mine. What we're asking the government to do is to take more control over our lives. And as we know from the Bible, human beings do not do well with power. And the system that's created in the United States government to check and balance power and to leave all the power that's not particularly given to the federal government, to the states, and to the individual citizens is a very wise way to do this. But as we move towards socialism, we're going to have to give the government more control. And that's why we find in socialist nations, the government becomes more authoritarian and more controlling. We have socialist nations moving more towards socialism that are democratic socialists. But that's only in name. When you get into those systems and you start to see the control that the government begins to take over the people, you realize it's not the kind of democracy that you and I have here. It's more and more government control. A free market or a capitalist nation tends to be more democratic. And it's very hard to find a capitalist free market government in history that persecuted and oppressed its people. But almost every government that persecuted and oppressed its people in the past, especially since the Industrial Revolution, have been socialist nations. Keep that in mind as we move forward and start talking more and more in our nation about trying to go towards socialist ideas. We don't know what we're talking about. But we do need government in free markets. Not to say that we don't need government. We need government. Remember Romans 12:13, God says that we are to have the government. He has set the government in His own power. But in a free market, you still need government. You need them to protect property rights. You need to uphold the laws. You need to provide public goods that individuals wouldn't produce, like national defense. You need to protect the poor and stuff like that. But what you want is you only want to give the government what it absolutely has to have to do those things. Because when you add the government in, it increases the costs, it slows down innovation, it reduces incentive, and it limits freedom. So when we look at our chart here, our scorecard, we go down the line and we see that again, from a standpoint of freedom, the capitalist free market system is the best. So the conclusion here, as we come to the end, the conclusion is to say that as you move on this continuum towards socialism, as we in a nation start to see that happening, start to see people calling for that, we are moving towards less incentive, which means greater poverty, less wealth creation. We're moving to less freedom. We're moving to more oppression in our government. And you're seeing it happen now. As you hear people talk about socialism, they're also talking about control. So there is a better way for this. There is a better way for an economy to be run, and it is to limit the government as much as possible and give freedom to the individuals, the business owners and the buyers, the consumers, to make those decisions. That is how we have become as prosperous as we are. And as we move away from this, we're going to find ourselves with less and less prosperity and more oppression from our government.